It was a war that ripped through America's veins, a brutal conflict born from loyalty, pride, and power. For decades, two of the most dangerous motorcycle clubs in the world turned the open road into a battlefield. From the 1970s to the 2000s, America's highways ran not with adventure but with blood. What began as a clash of identity between brotherhoods evolved into one of the longest and most violent turf wars in outlaw history. This was not a war between nations. It was a war between men bound by loyalty, silence, and blood. On one side stood the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, the most infamous biker organization on earth. On the other stood their relentless rivals, the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, equally feared and deeply rooted in America's heartland. The Outlaws' chilling motto, "God forgives, outlaws don't," was more than a slogan. It was a declaration of war. The Hells Angels, founded in Fontana, California on March 17, 1948, rose from the ashes of post-World War II America. Many founding members were veterans, disciplined men who struggled to adjust to peace. They built a new brotherhood that rejected conformity, embracing the road as their battlefield and rebellion as their creed. Their image, leather vests, denim, and the winged skull emblem, became one of the most recognizable symbols of defiance in the world. They expanded quickly, first across the West Coast, then worldwide, becoming legends of the outlaw biker world. On the other side stood the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, established earlier in 1935 in McCook, Illinois. They were older, rougher, and grittier, products of the industrial Midwest. If the Angels ruled the sun-soaked West, the Outlaws ruled the steel towns and rural backroads of the East and South. The Mississippi River became their silent border. The West belonged to the Hells Angels. The East belonged to the Outlaws. For years, this uneasy peace held, until expansion brought their territories crashing together. In 1974, at the American Motorcyclist Association National Rally in Columbus, Ohio, tensions finally exploded. Hundreds of bikers from both sides clashed in a massive brawl that marked the beginning of open war. The fragile peace was gone, replaced by blood, vengeance, and chaos. But the worst was yet to come. By the 1990s, the feud had escalated into an organized, strategic war. Within the Hells Angels, an elite and secretive patch known as the Filthy Few represented members who had allegedly killed for the club. According to FBI intelligence, a Cincinnati Hells Angel was rumored to have earned that patch by murdering an Outlaws member in 1993. It was the ultimate act of defiance, and the Outlaws' leadership vowed revenge. Their answer was a patch of their own, ADIOS, an acronym for Angels Die in Outlaw States. It was not a warning. It was a promise. Any Hells Angel found east of the Mississippi would face death. From that moment on, this was no longer about drugs, bars, or roots. It was a war of extermination. Cincinnati became ground zero, a vital outlaw stronghold and the front line of the new war. The city's streets turned into a battlefield as shootings, bombings, and ambushes spread fear among civilians and law enforcement alike. April 29, 1994. The Bullpen Inn. It was a quiet evening in a Fairfield bar known to host Hells Angels associates. Suddenly, gunfire erupted. Men wearing Outlaws colors opened fire through the doors and windows. When it was over, one man was dead and several were wounded. The message was clear. There were no neutral parties anymore. June 20th, 1994. The clubhouse retaliation. The Angels struck back. Police reports and witness statements describe a wave of targeted attacks on Outlaws-linked locations across Ohio and Kentucky. Car bombings, drive-by shootings, and arson became common tactics. The violence forced the FBI to launch one of the most extensive organized crime investigations in American history. Both clubs were hit with RICO charges, mass indictments, and raids across multiple states. But the war never truly ended. Even today, tensions remain, silent but simmering, between these two legendary clubs that helped define the meaning of outlaw. What began as brotherhood became bloodshed. What started as rebellion became a war that forever changed the outlaw biker world and left a mark on American history that will never fade. Just under 2 months later, the Hells Angels struck back. Their target was the very heart of the Outlaws' power in Cincinnati, their clubhouse on Spring Grove Avenue. This was not just a bar. It was a fortified stronghold, a symbol of their dominance. A vehicle carrying several Hells Angels associates drove past the building and unleashed a hail of gunfire, riddling the facade with bullets. Miraculously, no one inside was killed, but the message was unmistakable. The conflict had escalated from personal attacks to direct assaults on each other's strongholds. The sanctity of the clubhouse had been violated, setting a dangerous new precedent. By July 1994, the violence entered a new phase, the era of the pipe bomb. The Outlaws began using improvised explosive devices to instill fear and chaos. One bomb was placed at the home of a Hells Angels mother, deliberately targeting family to cause maximum psychological damage. Another was planted at a bar frequented by Angels associates. These devices were not simply weapons. They were instruments of terror designed to create a constant state of paranoia. The message was clear: no one was safe. Not at home, not in their neighborhood, not even the innocent relatives of club members. The Cincinnati Police Department's bomb squad and the FBI were now in crisis mode. Wiretaps were authorized on an unprecedented scale, and informants were recruited aggressively to penetrate the wall of silence that surrounded both clubs. Just as Cincinnati seemed ready to explode, the war revealed its national scale. Violence erupted in other key cities from Chicago to Florida, turning local turf wars into a coast-to-coast battlefield. In Chicago, tensions between the Outlaws and the Hells Angels were at a constant fever pitch. On September 12, 1997, the conflict took an especially bold turn when a Hells Angels member was shot and wounded in a Chicago suburb. The Outlaws were the immediate suspects. Humiliated and furious, the Angels vowed swift and devastating retaliation. But it was in Florida, a prized territory for both clubs because of its drug routes, tourist flow, and year-round riding weather, where the war reached its bloodiest moment. This became known as the Holiday Shootout. On July 28, 2002, around 3 p.m., a group of Hells Angels from the Monroe, New York chapter stopped for a drink at a VFW hall in the quiet town of Holiday near Tampa. It was a fatal mistake. They were deep inside Outlaws territory, an area where displaying rival colors was seen as an act of war. To the Outlaws, this was not a minor provocation. It was a full-scale invasion. Their response was immediate and overwhelming. A convoy of vehicles carrying armed outlaws descended on the VFW hall. What followed was not a brawl, but a military-style ambush. The Outlaws, armed with handguns, shotguns, and assault rifles, opened fire on the building. The Hells Angels, though outnumbered and caught off guard, barricaded themselves inside and returned fire. The peaceful Florida afternoon erupted into chaos. Witnesses described it as sounding like a war zone. When the shooting stopped, more than 150 rounds had been fired. The parking lot was covered in shell casings, shattered glass, and blood. 2 Hells Angels, Todd Frenchie Roebuck and Inadino Ed Lopez, were dead. 3 others were critically wounded. The Outlaws fled the scene, leaving behind devastation that would dominate national headlines for days. The holiday shootout exposed just how organized and heavily armed these clubs had become. They were no longer just motorcycle gangs. They were functioning as paramilitary forces. For law enforcement, it was the final turning point. The FBI had been building cases for years, but this massacre pushed them into action. It was time to dismantle both organizations from the top down. The result was Operation Black Rain, a massive multi-state investigation that would become the largest coordinated crackdown on outlaw motorcycle clubs in U.S. history. The first major blow came on October 3, 2002, only months after the Florida shootout. At dawn, federal agents raided Outlaws clubhouses and members' homes, arresting dozens in direct connection with the ambush. The Department of Justice sent a message. Mass violence in broad daylight would no longer be tolerated, but the defining strike came on September 28, 2005, at 6 a.m., Operation Black Rain in full motion. Hundreds of federal agents from the FBI, ATF, and DEA, alongside state and local police, executed simultaneous raids across Ohio, Kentucky, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Florida. The element of surprise was total. The indictments unsealed that day were staggering. They included charges of murder, attempted murder, racketeering, conspiracy, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and extortion. The government invoked the RICO Act, allowing prosecutors to treat the entire clubs as criminal enterprises. This meant that leaders could be charged not only for their own crimes, but for the actions they ordered others to commit. In Cincinnati, the epicenter of the conflict, key figures from both sides were arrested. Men responsible for bombings, shootings, and intimidation campaigns. They were paraded before cameras as the federal government declared, "Your war, your rules, your territory, they are now null and void. Your war is our case, and it will be tried in our courts." The massive prosecutions that followed between 2005 and 2008 accomplished what decades of violence could not. They forced both sides into an uneasy stalemate. With national and chapter leaders facing decades or even life in federal prison, the all-out war cooled from a boil to a simmer. The constant bombings and public shootouts largely came to an end. But to say the war ended would be misleading. The divide between the two clubs still defines the outlaw landscape across America. The ideology of revenge and dominance remains deeply embedded in both organizations. Occasional bursts of violence continue to surface, reminders that the hatred has not disappeared. On April 20, 2014, a Hells Angels member was shot and killed outside a restaurant in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, deep within Outlaws territory. These incidents are echoes of a war that refuses to die. The conflict between the Hells Angels and the Outlaws Motorcycle Club was never just a string of crimes. It was a decades-long struggle for identity, power, and survival within a world governed by its own brutal code. From the first national clashes in the 1970s to the bombings of the 1990s, from the gunfire in Cincinnati to the massacre in Holiday, Florida, and finally the federal takedown of Operation Black Rain, the war redefined the meaning of organized crime in America. It created invisible borders across the nation, dividing cities and highways by loyalty and fear. It left scars that remain etched in asphalt and memory. And through it all, one truth endures in the outlaw world. God may forgive, but as the outlaws vowed, and as the angels proved they believe, they never will. The road remains divided.